talk about how the Communist Party, is always trying to maintain power and suppress political opponents. But if you look at political parties in the West, whether it's the Democrats and Republicans, or another country you have Labor, conservative, liberal parties, Green parties, they're all trying to maximize power for themselves.
But not
right?
like with rape as a form of torture.
Right. Well, and this is what I wanted to get into, right? Is like, besides obviously that, what is fundamentally different about the Communist Party versus the political parties you see in Western liberal democracies?
Because it's a very important question. Western liberal democracies are informed, first of all, by Western civilization, which has respect for individuals as individuals, whether that's coming out of a traditional Catholic interpretation through European identity when it was Christendom, or whether it's coming through a democratic socialist, which of course is very important in the European context, or a liberal context, very important, of course, in Canada, the UK, United States, and France. So there's a respect for individuals, and there's a recognition that the state does have limits. The state can do certain things, certainly, and should do certain things, but it must respect the autonomy of individuals and individual rights and the dignities of individuals. And support or tolerate freedom. Individuals have certain rights which are given to them. It's recognized, of course, by very famously the French Revolution or the American Revolution, and it's the job of the state to essentially maintain those rights. Of course, there's a context within that, and there's a give and take, obviously, and that has been interpreted in different ways, of course, over the context of Western political history. But nonetheless, that's far superior to Leninism, right, or to the ideology of the Chinese Communist Party, which does not recognize that. It is a Leninist ideology, which says, of course, it is the vanguard of the proletariat or the workers and the peasants. Party rules in their name. And there can be, under democratic centralism, of course, there can be debate at highest levels of the party, but once the party decides, that is it. That is a system which is prone to abuse, and we have seen the worst human rights abuses come out of that ideology, whether it's the Khmer Rouge or whether it's the Chinese Communist Party under Mao or subsequently, or Stalin and its interpretation, or the Eastern European knockoffs of Stalinism. We've seen just horrible, the worst human rights abuses coming out of that type of system. You don't have that in the West because there are checks. There are a context which recognizes the value of individuals, which is absent, of course, in any type of communist system.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned Khmer Rouge, because I remember when one of the top leaders was on trial, he was saying he was fighting for social justice. And that is the twisted. That's why talking about ideology is important, I think, because there's a lot of people who will say, oh, like the United States is just as bad, if not worse, than China. And there's this idea, because it is part of the ideological battle where people are being educated to think that, communism is about social justice. How is that a bad thing versus, American capitalism, war for oil, et cetera, et cetera?
Well, certainly, but that, of course, is a misinterpretation of social communists. Of course, when they're out of power, when they're seeking to get into power, of course, have all sorts of. The Chinese Communist Party were agrarian reformers, right? They were sold as that, or Lenin said, bread, land, peace, right? That is what the objectives of the Bolsheviks were. Once in power, of course, they're totalitarian, and they very rapidly move to secure it, and they kill their enemies. And it's that brutal. And you know very quickly which way the wind is blowing. If you're going to resist them, of course, the communists will be coming for you. And that has led to the abuses that we saw, of course, in Soviet history and in Chinese history and elsewhere. We could go into Mengistu's rule in Ethiopia or the Khmer Rouge, of course, or MPLA in Angola. Right, we can go around the globe to see the nature of those abuses. It's inherent in the ideology. So wherever it shows up, you're going to have those types of abuses. Now, that can be contrasted, I think, empirically Again, look around the world and see what the United States has done, despite the flaws and mistakes it has made in global politics. It is a very positive force for advancing conceptions of individual rights, the rights of women around the world, the rights of racial minorities, the rights of sexual minorities, in a way, of course, which would be bourgeois, obviously, for communists. So I think let's look empirically, and I think you can look at the record of the West, if you will, broadly, and you can look at the record of communist states, and it is essentially a very clear situation in terms of which society most individuals are going to want to live if they're given a choice, clearly. Obviously, the CCP doesn't give people a choice, and so that's in large measure the cause of the problems that China faces today.
You mentioned that the Biden administration you see as the last gasp of an old regime, the engagement school way of looking at China and the CCP. When we talk about people being misled about not understanding the ideology of communism or the Communist Party, we aren't talking about, in this case, 19-year-old university students. We're talking about, people who have come up through the government who have been dealing with foreign policy for decades. How did this happen that they could completely ignore that ideological basis you're talking about?
Well, it's a very curious issue how they could completely ignore it, or how they could ignore the principles of strategy, which would govern and should govern American foreign policy. And the first rule of which, of course, is don't assist your adversary. Well, the engagement school has done almost everything that it could to aid the CCP. So it's a very important issue. I think Jim Fennell and I are finishing a book actually on this topic, which is looking at how could this happen? How is it that the United States could go from the success of the defeat of the Soviet Union, let's say 1991, to the situation today where we have a pure competitor? And how could that happen? Well, it's a very interesting and very complicated story, but a big part of it is that our elites in the foreign policy and economic communities were divorced from strategy. They were divorced from an understanding of what communism was. There was an end of history moment, right, which was a very powerful motivator, which allowed us to understand that there were no longer going to be great power conflicts, that we were moving in as Fukuyama identified, in that Hegelian sense. History had resolved itself. We knew that capitalism and liberal democracy were the essentially best form of polity, and so ideological conflicts were going to fall away. But also Deng Xiaoping's very successful political warfare strategy, where he was able to make the American elite and Western elites broadly his partner. That what he did is he recognized that you could buy the American elite, essentially, and you could buy them for very little money, as it turned out, and by allowing them to have handsome returns to their investments, they would become your partners, they would become your defender, and you would use their power to gain additional influence in the halls of Congress, of course, in the America, or with our media, obviously, foundations, think tanks, etc. So it's an issue we've thought a lot about when we're reflecting on how this could happen. How is it that the United States could assist the rise of its peer without ever balancing against it? Now, external elements are relevant there too. 9/11, of course, had an important role to play. But it was a supremely successful case of what we term threat deflation, where Deng and then obviously his successors went out of their way to minimize the threat that they were seen to pose by also working with elites around the world to also help minimize the conception that China was communist or that China was a threat, right? It was, after all, Fukuyama said, we're all on the road to the end of history. We're all on the road to liberal democracy. So the Chinese might have a little bit of some stickiness, right, in moving along that path, but ultimately they'd get there, right? And that led to a lot of self-justification and rationalization, I think, for tremendous amounts of investment in the PRC, which sadly continues to this day. So I hope to be back, and perhaps when the book is out, of course, we could have a discussion on that very interesting topic as well.
Maybe we could get you and Jim on at the same time. That'd be fun. But so this is why I think it's important to talk about communist ideology in this way, because a lot of people, if they talk about communism, it's, Marx, Lenin, Stalin, Mao. But I know you take the time to also talk about the Frankfurt School and Gramsci. And so give us that side of the story.
Well, certainly very influential. Gramsci and the Frankfurt School independently recognized communism was not going to come to the West based on a revolution on the factory floor. Western conditions were very different. The conditions of working people, the working class in the West, was very different from the way it was in Russia or elsewhere around the world. And so both of those groups, Gramsci with his own thought and the Frankfurt School alighting into Marcuse, alighting into really what we would call critical theory, adopt a different approach, which was you need to focus on ideas and you need to focus on the ideas industry. And where are ideas manufactured? Well, in the West, they're manufactured at universities. They're manufactured in film. They're manufactured in what was called also the culture industry. That would be radio, of course, television, popular music, many different avenues. And if you could advance messages that were not explicitly communist, but in fact were operating through front organizations or elsewhere, you would be able to essentially advance communism through stalking horses, for example, social justice, or other terms that sound very pleasing and right, and that are fully in accord and resonate with liberals. Again, small l, those who believe in political liberalism. And so in those ways, you would be able to advance communist thought, not explicitly, again, through communism, but through progressive thought, right? It would be, again, that those who are right-thinking, those who are on the cusp or in the vanguard of history will subscribe to those beliefs. And so by seizing the ideas industry, you're able to bring about a change without seizing, obviously, capitalism or the banks or those types of elements. You would be able to influence your students. You'd be able to influence literature. You'd be able to influence the intellectual classes. And then from there, over time, you would be able to, as Gramsci said, you would conduct your long march through the institutions by having these ideas spread throughout the totality of the cultural life, economic life, political life of a society. So communism would come not through a violent revolution, if you will. It would come on cat's paws, right? It would come in like fog in the night. But nonetheless, it would be successful in bringing about its revolution of destroying bourgeois life and replacing bourgeois life with essentially the communist preferred option. So very different types of approach, and very important to understand for understanding how communism has advanced in the West, and heavily influenced, of course, by Marcuse's ideas about repressive tolerance, that you do not tolerate ideas which are intolerant, right? Which was Marcuse's way of saying you don't tolerate essentially the respect for the First Amendment, the respect for intellectual debate, freedom of speech. You tolerate only ideas which are progressive, by nature communist. And those are only the ideas that you're going to allow. And so you very rapidly shrink any type of what we would understand in liberal thought, of course, the importance of debate, the importance of intellectual exchange, and a marketplace of ideas is obviously a product of bourgeois ideology for Marcuse. And what is necessary is to advance that communist revolution by only permitting proper thoughts, politically correct thoughts, to be advanced in culture, obviously, and then that would seep into other aspects, economic life, political life. And it has been very effective, really, at serving as the rocket fuel, if you will, for American progressives today.